Good day everyone and welcome to our review for board exam. We are doing psychological assessment for today and we have 15 questions for this session. Ready ka na ba? Let's start! Psychological assessment review questions. Number 1. Appraisal can be defined as A. The process of assessing or estimating attributes. B. Testing which is always performed in a group setting. C. Testing which is always performed on a single individual. Or letter D. A paper and pencil measurement of assessment attributes. Number 2. A test can be defined as a systematic method of measuring a sample of behavior. Test format refers to the way items are presented. The format of an essay test is considered a or an blank format. Is it A, subjective, B, objective, C, very precise, or D, concise? Number 3, the BLEPP or BLEPP is a or an blank test because the scoring procedure is specific. Is it A, subjective, B, objective, C, projective, or D, subtest? Number 4, a short answer test is a or an blank test. Is it A, objective, B, culture-free, C, forced choice, or D, free choice? Number 5, the BLEPP is a or an blank test. Is it A, free choice, B, forced choice, C, projective, or D, intelligence? Number 6, the blank index indicates the percentage of individuals who answered each item correctly. Is it A, difficulty, B, critical, C, intelligence, or D, personal? Number 7, short answer test and projective measures utilize free response items. The civil service exam and college entrance exam uses forced choice or so-called blank items. Is it A, vague, B, subjective, C, recognition, or D, numerical? Number 8, a true or false test has blank recognition items. Is it A, similar, B, free choice, C, dichotomous, or D, no? Number 9, a test format could be normative or ipsative. In the normative format, letter A, each item depends on the item before it. B, each item depends on the items after it. Or C, the client must possess an IQ within the normal range. Or D, each item is independent of all other items. Number 10, a client who takes a normative test, letter A, cannot legitimately be compared to others who have taken the test. B, can legitimately be compared to others who have taken the test. C, could not have taken an IQ test. Or D, could not have taken a personality test. Number 11, in an ipsative measure, the person taking the test must compare items to one another. The result is that A, an ipsative measure cannot be utilized for career guidance. B, you cannot legitimately compare two or more people who have taken an ipsative test. C. An ipsative measure is never valid. Or D. An ipsative measure is never reliable. Number 12. Tests are often classified as speed test versus power test. A time typing test used to hire secretaries would be letter A, a power test. B, neither a speed test nor a power test. C, a speed test. Or D, a fine example of an ipsative measure. Number 13. A counseling test consists of 300 force response items. The person taking the test can take as long as he or she wants to answer the question. Letter A. This is most likely a projective measure. B. This is most likely a speed test. C. This is most likely a power test. Or D. This is most likely an invalid measure. Number 13. An achievement test measures maximum performance, while a personality test or inventory measure A. Typical performance, B. Minimum performance, C. Unconscious traits, or D. Self-esteem by always relying on a Q-sort design. And number 15. In a spiral test, A. The items get progressively easier. B. The difficulty of the items remain constant. Letter C. The client must answer each question in a specified period of time. Or D. The items get progressively more difficult. And now, let's proceed to answers and explanation. Number 1. An appraisal can be defined as, and the answer is letter A, the process of assessing or estimating attributes. Appraisal is a broad term which includes merely testing clients. Appraisal could include a survey, observation, or even clinical interviews. So choices B, C, and D are too limited. A test is simply an instrument which measures a given sample of behavior. When we use the term measure, it merely connotes that a number or score has been assigned to the person's attribute or performance. Number 2, a test can be defined as a systematic method of measuring a sample of behavior. Test format refers to the way test items are presented. The format of an essay test is considered a or an blank format. And the answer is letter A, subjective. A subjective paradigm relies mainly on the scorer's opinion. If the rater knows the test taker's attribute, the rater's personal bias can significantly impact upon the rating. For example, an attractive examinee or an individual of some race might be given a higher rating. This is what we call as halo effect. In job setting, peer generally rate their colleagues higher than do their supervisor. In an objective test or choice B, the rater's judgment plays little or no part in the scoring process. Number 3, the BLEPP is a or an blank test because the scoring procedure is specific. And the answer is letter B, objective. Since the BLEPP uses A, B, or C alternative format, the raters or subjective feelings and thoughts would not be an issue. Next number 4. A short answer test is a blank test. And the answer here is letter D, pre-choice. Some exam will call this pre-response or a free response format. In any case, the salient point is that the person taking the test can respond in any manner he or she chooses. Although pre-choice response patterns can yield more information, they often take more time to score and increase subjectivity. Like there is more than once or there is more than one correct answer. Although testing is often controversial, school now employs psychoeducational tests more than at any time in history. Next number, number 5. The BLEPP is a or an blank test. And the answer is forced choice. Letter B. Forced choice are sometimes known as recognition items. On some tests, this format is used to control for the social desirability phenomenon, which asserts that a person puts the answer he or she feels is socially acceptable. Like, for example, the test provides alternatives that are all equal in terms of social desirability. In the MMPI-2 or Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory, for example, it uses forced choice to create a lie scale composed of human frailties that we all possess. This scale, therefore, ferrets out those individuals who try to make themselves look good, like the way they believe they should be. And next number, number 6, the blank index indicate the percentage of an individual who answered each item correctly. And the answer is letter A, difficulty. The higher the number of people who answer a question correctly, the easier the item is, and vice versa. A zero point 0.5 difficulty index, also called difficulty value, would suggest that 50% of those tested answered the questions correctly, while 50% did not. Most theories agree that a good measure provides a wide range of items that even a poor performer can answer correctly. Number 7, short answer test and projective measure utilize free response items. The civil service exam and the college entrance exam uses forced choice or so-called blank items. And the answer is letter C, recognition. Recognition items give the examinee two or more alternatives. Next number. A true or false test has blank recognition items. And the answer is dichotomous. Dichotomy simply means that you are presented with two opposing choices, and this explains why choice A is definitely incorrect. When a test gives the person taking exam 3 or more forced choices like the civil service exam and the college entrance exam, the psychometricians calls it a multi-point item. So choice B describes a situation in which the examinee can respond in any way he or she chooses. Number 9, a test format could be normative or ipsative. In the normative format, the answer is letter D. Each item is independent of all other items. Ipsative measures compare traits within the same individual. They do not compare a person to other person who took the instrument, like the Cooder Occupational Interest Survey, which is now called the Cooder Career Search, with person match is one such example. The ipsative test allows the person being tested to compare items. Number 10, a client who takes a normative test, the answer is letter B, can legitimately be compared to others who have taken the test. First, forget about choice A, it's ipsative. Technically, a normative interpretation is one in which the individual score is evaluated by comparing it to others who took the same test. A percentile rank is an excellent example. Say, your client score an 82 on a nationally normed test. On this score corresponds to the percentile rank of 60. This tells you that 60% of the individuals who took the test scored 82 or less. Number 11. In an ipsative measure, the person taking the test must compare items to one another. The result is that the answer is letter B. You cannot legitimately compare two or more people who have taken an ipsative test. Since the ipsative measure does not reveal absolute strength, comparing one person's score to another is relatively meaningless. The person is measured in response to his or her own standard of behavior. The ipsative measure points. It points out the highs and lows that exist within a single individual. Hence, when a colleague tells you that Mr. Edwards' anxiety is improving, she has given you an ipsative description. This description, however, would not lend itself to comparing Mr. Edwards' anxiety to Mrs. Cruz's. Number 12. Tests are often classified as speed tests versus power tests. A time typing test used to hire secretaries would be, the answer is letter C, a speed test. In terms of difficulty, a speed test is really intended to be fairly easy. The difficulty is induced by the time limitations and not the difficulty of the task or the questions themselves. Okay? Try giving your secretary a time keyboard test and give him or her 3 hours to complete it, and you'll see that he or she can do it well. A good time or speed test is purposely set up so that nobody finishes it. A power test, like choice C, choice A, is designed to evaluate the level of mastery without a time limit. A time test is really a type of speed test, but a high percentage of the test takers complete it, and it is usually more difficult and has a time limit. Number 13. A counseling test consists of 300 forced response items. The person taking the test can now take as long as he or she wants to answer the question. So the answer here is letter C. This is most likely a power test. Like the speed test, it will ideally be designed so that nobody receives a perfect score. Choice A, projective measure, stands incorrect since the projective tests rely on free response format. And number 14, an achievement test measures maximum performance while a personality test or interest inventory measures. And the answer is letter A, typical performance. Interest inventories are popular with career counselors because such measures focus on what the client likes or dislikes. The strong interest inventory is an excellent example. So choice D, the Q sort, often used to investigate personality traits, involves a procedure in which an individual is given cards with statement and asked to place them in piles of most like me or least like me. Then the subject compiles them to create the ideal self. The ideal self can then be compared to his or her current perception in order to assess self-esteem. And number 15. In a spiral test, the answer is letter D. The items get progressively more difficult. Just remember that a spiral staircase, it seems to get more difficult to climb as you walk up higher. And that's the end of our drill for today. I hope you learned a lot. Don't forget to click the subscribe button and hit the notification bell for updates on our drill. Keep safe and have a nice day. Good day everyone and welcome to our review for board exam. Again, we are going to do psychological assessment and today we have 15 questions for this session. Ready ka na ba? Let's start! Psychological assessment review questions. Number 1. In a cyclical test, A. The items get progressively easier. B. The difficulty of the items remain constant. C. You have several sections which are spiral in nature. Or D. The client must answer each question in a specified period of time. Number 2. A test battery is considered A. A horizontal test. B. A vertical test. C. A valid test. Or D. A reliable test. Number 3. In a counseling research study, two groups of subjects took a test with the same name. However, when they talked with each other, they discovered that the questions were different. The researcher assured both groups that they were given the same test. How is this possible? Is it A? The researcher is not telling the truth? The groups could not possibly have taken the same test? B. The test was horizontal. C. The test was not a power test. Or D. The researcher gave parallel forms of the same test. Number 4. The most critical factors in test selections are A. The length of the test and the number of people who took the test in the norming process. B. Horizontal versus vertical. C. Validity and reliability. And letter D. Spiral versus cyclical format. Number 5. Which is more important, validity or reliability? Is it A. Reliability? B. They are equally important. C. Validity. Or D. It depends on the test in question. Number 6. In the field of testing, validity refers to letter A. Whether the test really measures what it purports to measure. B. Whether the same test gives consistent measurement. C. The degree of cultural bias in a test. Or letter D. The fact that numerous tests measure the same test. Number 7. A counselor peruses a testing catalog in search of a test which will repeatedly give consistent result. The counselor, letter A, is interested in a reliability. B, is interested in validity. C, is looking for information which is not available. Or letter D, is magnifying an unimportant issue. Number 8. Which measure would yield the highest level of reliability? Is it A, TAT, projective test popular with psychodynamic helpers? B, the WAIS 3, a popular IQ test? C, the MMPI-2, a popular personality test? Or letter D, a very accurate scale? Number 9, construct validity refers to the extent that a test measures an abstract trait or psychological notion. An example would be A. Height, B. Weight, C. Ego strength, or D. The ability to name all men who have served as Philippine president. Number 10. Face validity refers to the extent that a test, letter A, looks or appears to measure the intended attribute. B. Measures a theoretical construct. C. Appears to be constructed in an artistic fashion. Or D. Can be compared to job performance. Number 11. A job test which predicted future performance on the job very well would, letter A, have high criterion or predictive validity. B, have excellent face validity. C, have excellent construct validity. Or D, not have incremental validity or synthetic validity. Number 12, a new IQ test which yielded result nearly identical to other standardized measure would be said to have letter A, good concurrent validity. Letter B, good face validity. Letter C, superb internal consistency. Or letter D, all of the above. Number 13, when a counselor tells a client that the graduate record examination or GRE will predict her ability to handle graduate work, the counselor is referring to, is it A, good concurrent validity, B, construct validity, C, face validity, or D, predictive validity. 14. A reliable test is blank valid. A, always. B, 90%. C, not always. Or D, 80%. And number 15. A valid test is blank reliable. Is it A, not always? B, always. C, never. Or D, 80%. And let's now proceed to answers and explanation. Number 1, a cyclical test, and the answer is letter C. You have several sections which are spiral in nature. In each section, the question would go from easy ones to those that are more difficult. Number 2, a test battery is considered, and the answer is letter A, horizontal test. In a test battery, several measures are used to produce results that could be more accurate than those derived from merely using a single source. In testing, a vertical test would have versions for various age brackets or levels of education like math achievement test for preschoolers and a version for grade school. A horizontal test measures factors like math and science during the same testing procedure. Number 3, in counseling research study, two groups of subjects took a test with the same name. However, when they talked with each other, they discovered that the questions were different. The researcher assured both groups that they were given the same test. How is it possible? The answer is letter D. The researchers gave parallel forms of the same test. When a test has two versions or forms that are interchangeable, they are termed parallel form or equivalent form of the same test. From a statistical or psychometric standpoint, each point or form must have the same mean, standard deviation, or standard error, and other statistical component. Number 4, the most critical factors in test selections are, the answer is letter C, validity and reliability. Validity refers to whether the test measures what it says it measures, while reliability tells us how consistent a test measures an attribute. Number 5, which is more important, validity or reliability? And the answer is letter C, validity. Experts nearly always consider validity the number one factor in the construction of a test. A test must measure what it purports to measure. Reliability, or choice A, is the second most important concern. A scale, for example, must measure body weight accurately if it is a valid instrument. And in order to be reliable, it will need to give repeated readings which are nearly identical for the same person if the person keeps stepping on and off the scale. Number 6, in the field of testing, validity refers to, and the answer is letter A, whether the test really measures what it purports to measure. To be valid, the test must measure what you want it to measure. Incidentally, a test which is valid for one population is not necessarily valid for another group. There are five basic types of validity that we should all be familiar with. Number one, no? The first is the content validity, or what is sometimes called the rational or logical validity. Like, does the test examine or sample of behavior under scrutiny? An IQ test, for example, that did not sample the entire range of intelligence, let's say the test just sampled memory and not vocabulary or math or others, it would have a poor content validity. So in this case, a savant might truly score higher than a well-rounded individual with genius level mentality. Second, construct validity, which refers to a test ability to measure a theoretical construct like intelligence, self-esteem, artistic talent, mechanical ability, or managerial potential. And third is concurrent validity, which deals with how well the test compares to other instruments that are intended for the same purpose. Fourth, predictive validity is also known as empirical validity, which reflects the test ability to predict future behavior according to established criteria. On some exams, concurrent validity and predictive validity are often lumped under the umbrella of criterion validity, since concurrent validity and predictive validity are actually different types of criterion related validity. And fifth, a small body of literature speaks of consequential validity, which simply tries to ascertain the social implication of using the test. Number seven, a counselor peruses a testing catalog in search of a test which will repeatedly give consistent result. The counselor, and the answer is letter A, is interested in reliability. We have to be aware that a test can indeed be reliable yet not valid. A highly reliable test could conceivably prove invalid. A scale that invariably reads 29 kilos when you weigh 43 kilos would hardly be providing a valid assessment of your true weight. The score, nevertheless, is consistent or reliable. Thus, a test can have a high reliability coefficient but still have low validity coefficient. Reliability places a ceiling on validity, but validity does not set the limits on reliability. Number eight, which measures would yield the highest level of reliability? And the answer? Letter D, a very accurate scale. In the real world, physical measurements are more reliable than psychological ones. Number nine, construct validity refers to the extent that a test measures an abstract trait or psychological notion. An example would be, and the answer is letter C, ego strength. Any trait you cannot directly measure or observe can be considered a construct. Number 10, face validity refers to the extent that a test, the answer is A, looks or appears to measure the intended attribute. Most experts technically no longer list face validity as six type of validity. Face validity, like a person's face, merely tells you whether the test looks like it measures the intended trait. Does your therapist look like a therapist? Does the Wechsler appear to be an IQ test? The obvious answer is, in most cases, who cares? It's not that important. And if a therapist looks like a good therapist, does that necessarily mean that he is adept in therapy? Of course not. And the same is true of testing. Face validity is not required test information according to the 1974 committee that drafted the standards for educational and psychological tests. Number 11, a job test which predicted future performance on a job very well would. The answer? Letter A, have high criterion or predictive validity. Here, you are concerned with the test, whether it will measure an independent or external outside criterion. In this case, future prediction of job performance. We have to note that A would be incorrect on questions such as this. If the question specified job performance, if this were the case, then technically only the term criterion would apply. So choice D, introduces you to the terms incremental validity and synthetic validity. Although incremental validity and systematic validity are not considered two of the five or six major types of validity, don't be surprised if they pop up in your exam questions. The term incremental validity has been used to describe a number of testing phenomena. First and foremost, incremental validity had been used to describe the process by which a test refined and becomes more valid as contradictory items are dropped. Next, number 12. A new IQ test which yielded results nearly identical to other standardized test measures would be said to have letter A good concurrent validity. Criterion validity could be concurrent or predictive. Concurrent validity answers the question of how well your test stacks up against a well-established test measures that the same behavior or construct or traits. Evidence for reliability and validity is expressed through correlation coefficient. Suffice to say that the closer you are to one, the better. You also should be familiar with the terms convergent and discriminant validity. These terms relate to both criterion validity and construct validity. The relationship or correlation of a test to an independent measure or trait is known as convergent validity. Convergent validity is actually a method used to assess a test, construct, or criterion validity by correlating test scores with an outside source. Let's say, for example, that a measure purports to measure phobic response. A client who has a snake phobia is then exposed to a snake and experienced extreme panic. If the client scores higher on the test than he would in a relaxed state, then this would display convergent validity. The tests also show discriminant validity. This means the test will not reflect unrelated variables. Hence, if phobias are unrelated to IQ, then when one correlates IQ scores to their scores on test phobia, this should produce a zero or near zero correlation. Similarly, if discriminant validity is evident, a counselor who is genuinely qualified to sit for a state licensing exam should score higher on the exam than a student to flunk an introductory counseling course. When a researcher is engaged in test validation, both convergent and discriminant validity should be thoroughly examined. Number 13, when a counselor tells a client that the graduate record exam, GRE, will predict her ability to handle graduate work, the counselor is referring to. The answer, letter D, predictive validity. The GRE or the Scholastic Aptitude Test or the college entrance exam and public opinion polls are effective only if they have high predictive validity, which is the power to accurately describe future behavior or events. Again, the subtypes of criterion validity are concurrent and predictive validity. Number 14, a reliable test is blank valid. The answer is not always letter C. Again, shout this out loud, a reliable test is not always valid. Reliability nonetheless determines the upper level of validity. And number 15, a valid test is blank reliable. And the answer is letter B, always. A valid test is always reliable. Choice B is correct because a test that measures a given trait well does so repeatedly. Remember that a reliable test, however, is not necessarily always valid. After all, like a depression scale that was invalid and really measured anxiety could produce consistent, reliable anxiety data. And that's the end of our drill for today. I hope you learned a lot. And don't forget to click the subscribe button and hit the notification bell for updates on our drill. Keep safe and have a nice day. Good day everyone and welcome to our review for board exam. Again, we will be doing psychological assessment for today. We'll have another 15 questions for this session. Ready ka na ba? Let's start! Psychological assessment review questions. Number 1. One method of testing reliability is to give the same test to the same group of people 2 times and then correlate the scores. This is called A. Test-retest reliability. B. Equivalent forms reliability. C. Alternate forms reliability. Or D. The split half method. Number 2. One method of testing reliability is to give the same population alternate forms of identical tests. Each form will have the same psychometric or statistical properties as the original instrument. This is known as A. Test-retest reliability. B. Equivalent or alternate form reliability. C. The split half method. Or D. Internal consistency. Number 3. A counselor doing research decided to split a standardized test in half by using the even item as one test and the odd items as the second test, and then correlating them. The counselor, letter A, used an invalid procedure to test reliability. B was testing reliability via the split half method. C was testing reliability via the equivalent form method. And letter D was testing reliability via the inter-rater method. Number 4. Which method of reliability testing would be useful with an essay test but not with a test of algebra problems? Letter A, test-retest. Letter B, alternate forms. Letter C, split half. Or letter D, inter-rater or inter-observer. Number 5, a reliability coefficient of 1.0 indicates a lot of variance in the test. B, a score with high level of error. C, a perfect score which has no error. Or D, a typical correlation on most psychological and counseling tests. Number 6, an excellent psychological or counseling test would have high reliability coefficient of, is it A, 50, B, zero point 0.9, C, 1.0, or D, negative 0.90. Number 7, a researcher working with a personality test discovers that the test has a reliability coefficient of 0.70, which is somewhat typical. This indicates that letter A, 70% of the score is accurate, while 30% is inaccurate. B, 30% of the people who are tested will receive accurate scores. Or C, 70% of people who are tested will receive accurate scores. Or D, 30% of the score is accurate while 70% is inaccurate. Number 8, a career counselor is using a test for job selection purposes. An acceptable reliability coefficient would be blank or higher. Is it A, 0.20, B, 0.55, C, 0.80, or D, 0.70? Number 9. The same test is given to the same group of people using the test-retest reliability method. The correlation between the first and second administration is zero point 0.7. The true variance, like percentage or of shared variance or the level of the same thing measured in both, is A, 70%, B, 100%, C, 50%, or D, 49%. Number 10, IQ means. Is it A, a query of intelligence? B, indication of intelligence? C, intelligence quotient? Or D, intelligence questions for test construction? Number 11, who did research and concluded that intelligence was normally distributed like height or weight, and that it was primarily genetic? Is it A, Spearman, B, Guilford, C, Williamson, or D, Francis Galton? Number 12, Francis Galton felt intelligence was, is it A unitary faculty, B, best explained via a two-factor theory, C, best explained via the person's environment, or D, fluid and crystallized in nature? Number 13, J.P. Guilford isolated 120 factors, which added up to intelligence. He also is remembered for his A, thoughts on convergent and divergent thinking, B, work on cognitive therapy, C, work on behavior therapy, or D, work to create the first standardized IQ test. Number 14, a counselor is told by a supervisor to measure the internal consistency reliability, like homogeneity, of a test, but not to divide the test in halves. The counselor would need to utilize A, the split half method, B, the test-retest method, C, the Kuder-Richardson coefficient of equivalence, or D, a cross-validation. And last, number 15. The first intelligence test was created by A, David Wechsler, B, J.P. Guilford, C, Francis Galton, or letter D, Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon. And now, let's proceed to answers and explanation. Number 1. One method of testing reliability is to give the same test to the same group of people 2 times and then correlate the scores. This is called, the answer is letter A, test-retest validity. The well-known test-retest method discussed here tests for stability, which is the ability of a test score to remain stable or fluctuate over time. When the client takes the test again, when using the test-retest paradigm, the client generally takes the same test after waiting at least 7 days. The test-retest procedure is only valid for traits such as IQ, which remain stable over time and are not altered by mood, memory, or practice effect. Number two, one method of testing reliability is to give the same population alternate forms of the identical test. Each form will have the same psychometric statistical properties as the original instrument. This is known as letter B, equivalent or alternate form reliability. Here, a single group of examinee takes parallel forms of a test and a reliability correlation coefficient is figured on two sets of scores. Counterbalancing is necessary when testing reliability in this fashion. That is to say, half of the individuals get parallel form A first and half get B initially. This controls for variables such as fatigue, practice, and motivation. Number three, a counselor doing research decided to split a standardized test in half by using the even item as one test and the odd items as the second test, and then correlating them. The counselor is letter B, was testing reliability via the split half method. In this situation, the individual takes the entire test as a whole and then the test is divided into halves. The correlation between the half scores yields a reliable coefficient. When a researcher does not use even versus odd questions to split the test, he or she may do so using random number, merely dividing a test according to first half versus second half. It could confound the data due to practice and fatigue effects. Number four, which method of reliability testing would be useful with an essay test but not with the test of algebra problems? And the answer is letter D, inter-rater or inter-observer. Using choice D, several raters assess the same performance. This method has been called scorer reliability and is utilized with subjective tests such as projective to ascertain whether the scoring criteria are such that two persons who grade or assess the response will produce roughly the same score. Number five, a reliability coefficient of 1.00 indicates, and the answer is letter A or letter C, a perfect score which has no error. As stated earlier, this generally occurs only in physical measurement. Number six, an excellent psychological or counseling test would have a reliability coefficient of, and the answer is letter B, 0.9. 90% of the score measured the attribute in question, while 10% of the score is indicative of error. Number seven, a researcher working with a personality test discovers that the test has a reliability coefficient of 0.70, which is somewhat typical. This indicates that, and the answer is letter A, 70% of the score is accurate, while 30% is inaccurate. Number eight, a career counselor is using a test for job selection purposes. An acceptable reliability coefficient would be blank or higher. And the answer is letter C, 0.80. And although 0.70 is generally acceptable for most psychological attributes, for admissions for jobs, school, and so on, it should be at least 0.8, and some expert will not settle for less than 0.9. Number nine, the same test is given to the same group of people using test-retest reliability method. The correlation between the first and the second administration is 0.7. The true variance, like percentage of shared variance, or the level of the same thing measured in both is, the answer is letter D, 49%. So the key here is simplifying a question. To demonstrate the variance of one factor accounted by another, you merely have to square the correlation. Like what we have what we have here is 0.70. So 0.70 times 0.70 is equals to 0.49. And 0.49 times 100 is 49%. Your exam could refer to this principle as the coefficient of determination. Number 10, IQ means letter C, intelligence quotient. A quotient is the result when you perform division. The early ratio formula for Binet IQ score was mental age divided by chronological age times 100. The score indicated how you compared to those in your group age. 11. Who did research and concluded that intelligence was normally distributed like height or weight and that it was primarily genetic? The answer is letter D, Francis Galton. Galton felt intelligence was a single or so-called unitary factor. Number 12. Francis Galton felt intelligence was. The answer is letter A, unitary factor. Sir Francis Galton of England has been recognized as one of the major pioneers in the study of individual differences. Darwin believed that exceptional mental abilities were genetic and ran in family, and said just that in his 1869 work, Hereditary Genius. Choice B illuminates the position of Charles Spearman, who in 1904 postulated two factors, a general ability and a specific ability, or S, which were thought to be applicable to any mental task. As for choice D, it pops on exam from time to time. Fluid intelligence is flexible, culture free, and adjust to situation, while crystallized is rigid and does not change or adapt. Number 13, J.P. Gilford isolated 120 factors which added up to intelligence. He is also remembered for his letter A, thoughts on convergent and divergent. Using factor analysis, Guilford determined that there were 120 elements or abilities which added up to intelligence. Two of the dimensions, convergent and divergent thinking, are still popular terms today. Convergent thinking occurs when divergent thoughts and ideas are combined into a singular concept. Divergent thinking is the ability to generate a novel idea. So choice D would reflect primarily the work of Binet and Simon. Number 14. A counselor is told by his supervisor to measure the internal consistency, reliability of a test, but not to divide the test in halves. The counselor would need to utilize, and the answer is letter C, the Kuder-Richardson coefficient of equivalence. Internal consistency of homogeneity of items also is known as interim consistency. In plain everyday language, the supervisor wants the counselor to find out if each item on the test is measuring the same thing as every other item. Is performance on one item truly related to performance on another? This can be done by using the KR or Kuder-Richardson estimate, which are often denoted on exam as KR20 or KR21 formulas. Another statistic, Lee J. Cronbach, or the Cronbach-Alpers coefficient, has been used in this respect. So choice A is incorrect. Yes, the split half method does investigate internal consistency reliability, but it relies on splitting the test into halves. And last number 15, the first intelligence test was created by The answer is letter D, Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon. The year was 1904, and the French government appointed the commission to ferret out feeble-minded Parisians from those who were normal. Alfred Binet led the committee, and the rest is history. In 1905, Binet, along with his co-worker Simon, created a 30-question test with school-related items of increasing difficulty. Binet used his own daughters as test subjects in order to investigate mental processes, and also is cited as one of the pioneers in projective testing based on his work with ink blots. After testing nearly 3,000 children in the US in 1916, Lewis and Thurman of the Stanford University published an American version of the Binet that was translated into English and adapted to American children. In case you don't know the word yet, Stanford was adapted to the word Stanford University. And that's the end of our drill for today. I hope you learned a lot. Don't forget to click the subscribe button and hit the notification bell for updates on our drills. Keep safe and have a nice day. Magandang araw sa lahat, and once again, welcome to our review for board exam. We are doing the fourth part of our psychological assessment review today, and we will have 15 questions for this session. And I am ready when you are. Let's start. Psychological assessment review questions. Number 1. Today, the Stanford Binet IQ test is A. Non-standardized measure, B. A standardized measure, C. A projective measure, D. B and C. Number 2. IQ stands for intelligence quotient, which is expressed by letter A, CA over MA times 100. Letter B, MA over CA times 50. Letter C, MA over CA times 50. Or letter D, MA over CA times 100. Number 3, the Binet stress age-related task. Utilizing this method, a 9-year-old task would be one which A. Only a 10-year-old child could answer. B. Only an 8-year-old child could answer. C. 50% of the 9-year-olds could answer correctly. Or D. 75% of 9-year-olds could answer correctly. Number 4. Simon and Binet pioneered the first IQ test around 1905. The test was created to A. Assess high school senior in America. B. Assess U.S. military recruits. C. Discriminate normal from retarded Parisian children. Or D. Measure genius in the college population. Number 5. Today, the Stanford Binet is used from ages 2 to adulthood. The IQ formula has been replaced by the A. SAS, B. SUDS, C. Entropy, or D. ACPA. Number 6. Most experts would agree that the Wechsler's IQ test gained popularity as the Binet, letter A, must be administered in a group. B. Favored the geriatric population. C. Didn't seem to be the best test for adults. Or D. Was biased towards women. Number 7. The best IQ test for a 20-year-old single male would be the A. WPPSI 3, B, WAIS 3, or C, WISC 4, or D, computer-based testing. Number 8, the best intelligence test for a 6th grade girl would be the A, WPPSI 3, B, WAIS 3, letter C, WISC 4, or D, Merrill Palmer. Number 9, the best intelligence test for a kindergarten would be the A, WPPSI 3, B, WAIS 3, C, WISC 4, or D, Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. Number 10, the mean of the Wechsler and the Binet is blank, and the standard deviation is A, 100 and 100, B, 115 for Wechsler and 16 for Binet, C, 120, or D, 101. Number 11, group IQ tests like the Otis-Lennon, the Lord Thorndike, and the California test of mental abilities are popular in school setting. The advantage is that A, group tests are quicker to administer. B, group tests are superior form in terms of predicting school performance. C, group tests always have a higher degree of reliability. Or D, individual IQ tests are not appropriate for school children. Number 12, the group IQ test movement began A, in 1905, B, with the work of Binet, C, with the Army Alpha and Army Beta in the First World War, or letter D, with the AGCT in the Second World War. Number 13, in a culture fair test, A, items are known to the subject regardless of his or her culture. B, the test is not standardized. C, culture-free items cannot be utilized. Or D, African Americans generally score higher than whites. Number 14, the black versus white IQ controversy was sparked mainly by the 1969 article written by A, John Earl, B, Raymond Cattell, C, Arthur Jensen, or D, Robert Williams. Number 15, the MMPI-2 is A, an IQ test, B, a neurological test, C, a projective personality test, or D, a standardized test. And let's now proceed to answers and explanation. Number 1, today, the Stanford Binet IQ test is, the answer is letter B, a standardized measure. The Stanford Binet is standardized because the scoring and administration procedures are formal and well delineated. Measures which are not standardized, like choice A, lack procedural guidelines for scoring or administration and do not include quantitative information related to standards of performance. Number 2, IQ stands for the intelligence quotient, which is expressed by, the answer is letter D. The test is Binet's, but the most famous formula was created by the German Wilhelm Stern. The formula produced what is known as a ratio IQ today. A deviation IQ is utilized which compares the individual to a norm, like the person is compared to other in his or her group age. Thus, the present score indicates deviation from the norm. Although we still use the term IQ, the Binet today actually relies on a standardized age score, SAS, with a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 16. The Binet stress age-related task utilizing this method, a 9-year-old task would be one which the answer is letter C. 50% of the 9-year-olds could answer correctly. A 9-year-old task was defined as one in which one half of the 9-year-olds tested could answer successfully. Number 4, Simon and Binet pioneered the first IQ test around 1905. The test was created to, and the answer is letter C. Discriminate normal from retarded Parisian children. The Minister of Public Instruction from the Paris schools wanted to test to identify mentally retarded children so that they could be taught separately. The assumption was made that intelligence was basically the ability to understand school related material. In this regard, the choice D, some experts believe that Wechsler's is a better test for those who fall in the average range, while the Stanford Binet is more accurate for assessing extremes of intellect. Number 5. Today, the Stanford Binet is used from ages 2 to adulthood. The IQ formula has been replaced by the, and the answer is letter A, SAS. Although we still use the term IQ, the Binet today actually relies on a standard age score, SAS, with a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 16. Number 6, most experts would agree that Wechsler's IQ test gained popularity as the Binet, and the answer is letter C. Didn't seem to be the best test for adults. Choice A is incorrect. Both the Binet and the Wechsler's are individual tests which require specific training beyond the required for a group IQ test. David Wechsler felt the Binet was slanted towards verbal skill, and thus he added performance skills to a certain attributes which might have been cultivated in the background, which did not stress verbal proficiency. The Wechslers yield a verbal IQ, performance IQ, and a full scale IQ. The WAIS 3 has 7 verbal scales and 7 performance scales. Number 7, the best IQ for a 20-year-old single male would be the, and the answer is letter B, WAIS 3. Choice A, the WIPC or the Wechsler's Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence is suitable for ages 2 to 6 months to 7 to 3 months. Choice B, the Wechsler's Adult Intelligence Scale, is intended for ages 16 and beyond. Choice C, the Wechsler's Intelligence Scale for Children, is appropriate for 6 to 16 years, 11 months. And choice D is indicative of a paper and pencil test that has been modified so that the client can take the test via computer. Number 8, the best intelligence test for the 6th grade girl would be the, and the answer is letter C. Number 9, the best intelligence test for kindergarten would be the, and the answer is the WIPC 3. Since the child most likely would be between 3 to 7 years of age and 3 months, the WIPC would be the only possible choice. Choice D, the MBTI, is based on Carl Jung's analytic psychology. The MBTI uses dichotomous types. The test results in a 4-letter type score such as ISFJ, introversion, sensing, feeling, judging. We have to take note that intuition, though it begins with an I, is coded an N, since introversion begins with an I. Important exam hint, don't forget this. When a test is guided via a theory, it is known as a theory-based test or inventory. Number 10, the mean of the Wechsler and Binet is blank, and the standard deviation is blank. And the answer is letter B, 100, 15 for Wechsler, and 16 for Stanford Binet. IQs above 100 are above average, and those shy of 100 are below average. Number 11, group IQ tests like the Otis-Lennon and the Lord Thorndike and California test of mental abilities are popular in school settings. The advantage is that, and the answer is letter A. Group tests are quicker to administer. The First World War provided the impetus for the group testing movement. Approximately 2 million men were tested using the Army Alpha for literate and Army Beta for illiterate, and those from other countries. The catch is that the group tests are less inaccurate, or I mean, the group tests are less accurate and have low reliability. Number 12, the group IQ test movement began. And the answer is letter C, with the Army Alpha and Army Beta in the First World War. We have to take note of the word group testing. Okay? Number 13. In a culture fair test, the answer is letter A. Items are known to the subject regardless of his or her culture. The culture fair test attempts to expunge items which would be known only to an individual due to his or her background. The key is that ethics now consider it unethical to administer a test to a client from a given population unless that the test or inventory has been normed on that specific population. Number 14. The black versus white IQ controversy was sparked mainly by a 1969 article written by, and the answer is Arthur Jensen. John Ertl claimed he invented an electronic machine to analyze neural efficiency and take the place of the paper and pencil IQ test. The device relies on a computer, an EEG, a strobe light, and an electrode helmet. Jensen sparked tremendous controversy. Actually, that's putting it mildly, when he suggested that 1969 Harvard Educational Review article, How Much Can We Boost IQ and Scholastic Performance? That the closer people are genetically, the more alike their IQ scores will be. And number 15, the MMPI-2 is, and the answer is a standardized personality test. The original version of this instrument was created in 1940. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory 2. The current version since 1989 is known as a self-report personality inventory. The new MMPI designated via the version 2 is intended to help clinicians diagnose and treat patients. The test is said to have retained the best factors of the MMPI while updating the test and eliminating sexist wording. I hope you learned something new for today. Don't forget to click the subscribe button and hit the notification bell para ma-update kayo sa ating mga drills. Keep safe and have a nice day. Magandang araw sa lahat. Narito na naman tayo sa ating review for board exam. This time, another 15 questions na naman for psychological assessment ang pag-aaralan natin. Ready ka na ba? Let's start! Psychological assessment review questions. Number 1. The word psychometric means A. A form of measurement used by neurologists. B. Any form of mental testing. Letter C. A mental trait which cannot be measured. Or letter D. The test relies on a summated or linear rating scale. Number 2. In a projective test, the client is shown A. Something which is highly reinforcing. B. something which is highly charged from an emotional standpoint. Letter C, A and B. Or letter D, neutral stimuli. Number 3, the 16th PF reflects the work of A. Raymond B. Cattell, B. Carl Jung, C. James McKean Cattell, or letter D. Oscar K. Burroughs. Number 4, the Myers-Briggs type indicator reflect the work of, is it A. Raymond Cattell, B. Carl Jung, C. William Glasser, or D. Oscar K. Burroughs. Number 5, the counselor who favors projective measures would most likely be A. Rogerian, B. Strict behaviorist, C. TA therapist, or D. Psychodynamic clinician. Number 6, an aptitude test is to blank as an achievement test is to blank. Is it A. What has been learned? Potential. Letter B. Potential. What has been learned? Letter C. Profit from learning? Potential. Or letter D. A measurement of current skills? Potential. Number 7. Both the Rorschach and the thematic apperception test or TAT are projective tests. The Rorschach uses 10 inkblot cards while the TAT uses A. A dozen inkblot cards, B. Verbal and performance IQ scale, C. Pictures, or D. Incomplete sentences. Number 8. Test bias primarily results from A. A test being normed solely on white middle-class clients, B. The use of projective measures, C. Using whites to score the test, or D. Using IQ rather than personality test. Number 9. A counselor who fears the client has an organic neurological or motoric difficulty would most likely use the A. Bender-Jeschalk, B. Rorschach, C. MMPI or Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or letter D. Thematic Apperception Test or TAT. Number 10, an interest inventory would be least valid when used with A. A first-year college majoring in philosophy, B. A third-year college majoring in physics, C. An 8th grade male with an IQ of 136, or D. A 46-year-old white male construction worker. Number 11. One major criticism of interest inventories is that A. They have far too many questions. B. They are most appropriate for very young children. Letter C. They emphasize professional, possession, and minimize blue-collar jobs. Or letter D. They favor female pursuits. Number 12. Interest inventories are positive in the sense that A. They are reliable and not threatening to the test taker. B. They are always graded by the test takers. Letter C. They require little or no reading skills. Or letter D. They have high validity in nearly all age brackets. Number 13. A researcher performed a study that has excellent external or so-called population validity, meaning that the results have generalizability. To collect his data, the researcher gave client a rating scale in which they were to respond with strongly agree, neutral, somewhat disagree, or strongly disagree. This is A. A projective measure. B. An unacceptable for use in standardized testing. C. A speed test. Or D. A Likert scale. Number 14. The BLEPP is A. An intelligence test, B. An aptitude test, C. A personality test, or D. An achievement test. And last, number 15. The blank are examples of aptitude tests. Is it A, GATB, the O Net Ability Profiler, and the MCAT? B, GZTS and the MMPI? C, CPI and the MMPI? Or D, Strong and the LSAT? And let's now proceed to answers and explanation. Number 1, the word psychometric means, and the answer is letter B, any form of mental testing. Psychometrics literally refers to the branch of psychology which focuses on testing. Choice D is used to describe answer scales in which various values are given to different responses. For example, on a Likert scale, a strongly agree might be given a 5, yet an agree response might be rated a 4. The client score is then sum up of all the items. Number 2, in a projective test, the client is shown, and the answer is letter D, neutral stimuli. The idea here is that the client will project his or her personality if given an unstructured task. More specifically, there are several acceptable formats for projective tests. First, association, such as what comes to mind when you look at this ink blot. Second, completion. Complete these sentences with the real feeling. Third, construction, such as drawing a person. The theory is that self-report inventories like the MMPI do not reveal hidden unconscious impulses. In order to accomplish this, the client is shown vague, ambiguous stimuli such as picture or an ink blot. Some believe that by using projective measure, a client will have more difficulty faking his or her responses and that he or she will be able to expand on answers. Number 3, the 16PF reflect the work of, and the answer is letter A, Raymond B. Cattell. The 16PF or 16 Personality Factor Questionnaire is suitable for persons 16 and above and has been the subject of over 2,000 papers or other communication. The test measures key personality factors such as assertiveness, emotional maturity, and shrewdness. So choice C is another Cattell who coined the term mental test and spent researching mental assessment and its relation to reaction time at the University of Pennsylvania. James McKin-Cattell had originally worked with Wundt and later Galton. Tests and inventories like the 16PF that analyze data outside of a given theory are called factor analytic tests or inventories rather than theory-based tests. Number 4, the Myers-Briggs type indicator reflect the work of, and the answer is letter B, Carl Jung. The MBTI is based on Carl Jung's analytic psychology. The MBTI uses dichotomous types, extroversion versus introversion, sensing versus intuition, thinking versus feeling, and judging versus perceiving. The test result in a four-letter type score such as ISFJ or introversion, sensing, feeling, and judging. While Burros mentioned in choice D of this question as well as the last is noted for his mental measurement yearbook, which was the first major publication to review available tests. Number 5, the counselor who favored projective measure would most likely be A. The answer is letter D, psychodynamic clinician. Choices A, B, and C all reflect positions that do not rely heavily on unconscious mind, especially the behaviorists who believe that if you can't directly measure the behavior, then it is not meaningful. Some theories like Allport would contend that even if it is true that unconscious impulses exist, they are not very important. Number 6, an aptitude test is to blank as an achievement test is to blank. And the answer is letter B, potential what has been learned. An aptitude test assesses potential and predicts. An achievement test examines what you know, like in the BLEPP. Predictive validity is particularly important when choosing an aptitude test. Number 7, both Rorschach and thematic assessment tests are projective tests. The Rorschach uses 10 inkblot cards while the TAT uses, and the answer is letter C, pictures. The TAT consists of 30 cards plus one blank card. The test, which is intended for ages 4 and beyond, uses up to 20 cards when administered to any given individual, like 19 selected to fit the age and sex of the client, plus one blank card. The pictures on each of the card are intentionally ambiguous, and the client is asked to make up story for each of them. Choice D would describe a projective test such as router inkblot sentence blank, in which the subject completes an incomplete sentence with real feeling. Number 8, test bias primarily results from, and the answer is letter A, a test being normed solely on white middle class clients. This bias should be communicated to the client when the results are explained. Number 9, a counselor who fears the client has an organic neurological or motoric difficulty would most likely use the answer is letter A, Bender-Gesell. The Bender-Gesell motor test, named after Loretta Bender, is actually an expressive projective measure. Though, first and foremost, it is known for its ability to discern whether brain damage is evident, suitable for ages 4 and beyond. The client is instructed to copy 9 geometric figures, which the client can look at while constructing his or her own drawing. Number 10, an interest inventory would be least valid when used with, and the answer is letter C, an 8th grade male with an IQ of 136. Interest inventories work best with individuals who are of high school age or above. Inasmuch as interests are not extremely stable prior to that time, interests become quite stable around age 25. 11. One major criticism of interest inventory is that, and the answer is letter C. They emphasize professional position and minimize blue-collar job. Also take note of the fact that contrary to popular opinion, interests and abilities are not, that's right, highly correlated. A client, for example, could have a tremendous musical ability, yet could thoroughly dislike being a musician. Number 12, interest inventories are positive in the sense that, and the answer is letter A. They are reliable and not threatening to the test takers. Generally, an interest inventory would be the least threatening variety of test. Number 13, a researcher performs study that has excellent external so-called population validity, meaning that the results have generalizability. This is, and the answer is letter D, a Likert scale. Created by Rensis Likert in early 1930s, this scale helped improve the overall degree of measurement. Response categories include such choices as strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. Number 14, the BLEPP is, the answer is letter D, an achievement test. The BLEPP is testing your knowledge and application of material in a profession. And the last number, the blank are examples of aptitude tests. And the answer is letter A. The new ONET Ability Profiler is not literally a replacement for GAT-B or General Aptitude Test Battery. Nevertheless, since the GAT-B is dated, newer instruments might be more appropriate. The ONET Ability Profiler created to career exploration, counseling, and planning, and the GATP up with the new Medical College Admission Test. So choice B, the Glifford-Zimmerman Temperament Survey, is a personality measure for persons who do not have severe psychiatric disability. And that's the end of our drill. Ano score mo? Paki-comment mo naman. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell para lagi ka na-update sa mga drills natin. Keep safe and have a nice day. Good day everyone! Nandito naman tayo sa panibagong review session natin. And again, we're going to do psychological assessment. At meron ulit tayong 15 questions para sagutin nating lahat. Ready ka na ba? Let's start! Psychological assessment review questions. Number 1. One problem with interest inventories is that the person often tries to answer the question in a socially acceptable manner. Psychometricians calls this response style phenomenon as A. Standard error, B. Social desirability, C. Cultural bias, or D. Acquiescence. Number 2. An aptitude test predicts future behavior, while an achievement test measures what you have mastered or learned. In the case of a test like letter A. Binet, B. Wechsler, C. GRE, or D. Bender. Number 3. Your supervisor wants you to find a new personality test for your counseling agency. You should read A. Professional journals, B. The Bureau's Mental Measurements Yearbook, C. Classic textbooks in the field as well as test materials produced by the testing company, or letter D. All of the above. Number 4. The standard error of measurement tells you A. How accurate or inaccurate a test score is, B. What population responds best to the test, C. The accuracy for personality but not for IQ test, or D. The number of people used in norming the test. Number 5. A new IQ test has a standard error of measurement of 3. Tom scored 106 on the test. If he takes the test a lot, we can predict that about 68% of the time, A. Tom will score between 100 and 103. B. Tom will score between 100 and 106. C. Tom will score between 103 and 109. Or letter D. Tom will score higher than Betty, who scored 139. Number 6. A psychometrician created an achievement test with a reliability coefficient of 0.82. The test is shortened since many clients felt it was too long. The counselor or psychometrician shortened the test but logically assumed that reliability coefficient would be A. Approximately 0.88, B. Remain at 0.82, C. Be at least 10 points higher or lower, or letter D. Lower than 0.82. Number 7. A counselor can utilize psychological tests to help secure a blank diagnosis if third-party payments are necessary. Is it A. AACD, B. DSM or ICD, C. Percentile, D. Standard error. Number 8. A colleague of yours invents a new projective test. 17 counselors rated the same client using the measure and produced nearly identical assessment. This would indicate A. High validity, B. High reliability, C. Excellent norming studies, or D. Culture fairness. Number 9, counselors often shy away from self-report since A. Clients often give inaccurate answers. B. Ethics do not allow them. C. Clients need a very high IQ to understand them. Or letter D. They are generally very lengthy. Number 10. In most instances, who would be the best qualified to give the Rorschach ink blot test? Is it A. A licensed psychometrician? B. A licensed psychologist? C. A licensed social worker? Or D. Both A and C? 11. Your client, who is an outpatient hospital program, is keeping a journal of irrational thoughts. This would be A. An unethical practice based on ethical guidelines. B. Considered a standardized test. C. An informal assessment technique. Or D. An aptitude measure. Number 12, you are uncertain whether a test is intended for the population served by your not-for-profit agency. The best method of researching this dilemma would be A. To contact CHED, responsible for psychology graduate program. B. Make a long-distance call to the person who created the test. C. Read the test manual included with the test. Or D. Give the test to 6 or more clients at random. Number 13. What clients should know about assessment? A. Validity is more important than reliability. B. Projective tests favor psychodynamic theory. C. Face validity is not that important. Or D. A test is merely a single source of data and not infallible. Number 14. One major testing trend is A. Computer-assisted testing and computer interpretations. B. More paper and pencil measure. C. To give school children at least 3 IQ tests per year. Or D. To train pastoral counselor to do projective testing. Number 15. Mike takes a math achievement test. In order to predict his score, if he takes the test again, the counselor must know A. The range of scores in his class. B. The standard deviation. C. The standard error of measurement. Or letter D. The mode for the test. And now we go to answers and explanation. Number one problem with interest inventories is that the person often tries to answer the question in a socially acceptable manner. Psychometricians call this response style phenomenon as the answer is letter B, social desirability. The converse choice B occurs when an individual purposely or when in doubt gives usual or unusual responses. This phenomenon is known as deviation. Choice D manifests itself when a client always agrees with something. Number 2, an aptitude test predicts future behavior, while an achievement test measures what you have mastered or learned. In the case of a test like, the answer is GRE. The GRE attempts to predict graduate school performance, but it also tests your level of knowledge. Some exams will refer to this like the GRE, MAT, MCAT, SAT, etc. as aptitude achievement test. Number 3, your supervisor wants to find a new personality test for your counseling agency. You should read, and the answer is letter D, all of the above. It has been discovered that if counselor involves the client in the process of the test selection, it will improve his or her cooperation in the counseling process. Now, number 4, the standard error of measurement tells you, and the answer is letter A, how accurate or inaccurate a test score is. If a client decided to take the same test over and over again, you could plot a distribution of scores. This would be the standard error of measurement for the instrument in question. Suffice it to say, The lower, the better. A low standard error means high reliability. Number 5, a new IQ test has a standard error of measurement of 3. Tom scores 106 on the test. If he takes the test a lot, we can predict that about 68% of the time. And the answer is letter C. Tom will score between 103 and 109. Calculated simply by taking 106 minus 3 is equals to 103. And 106 plus 3 is 109. Okay, so it's between 103 and 109. Your exam could refer to this as the 68% confidence interval. Classical test theory suggests the formula x is equals to t plus e, where x is the obtained score, t is the true score, and the e is the error. Number 6, a psychometrician created an achievement test with a reliability coefficient of 82.82. The test is shortened since the many clients felt it was too long. The psychometrician shortened the test but logically assumed that the reliability coefficient would now, and the answer is letter D, lower than 0.82. Increasing a test length raises reliability. Shorten it, it is the antithesis that occurs. Note that the Spearman-Brown formula is used to estimate the impact that lengthening or shortening a test would have on a test reliability coefficient. Number 7, a counselor can utilize psychological tests to help secure a blank diagnosis. And the answer is letter B, DSM or ICD. Diagnosis is a medical term which asserts that you classify a disease based on symptomatology. Number 8, a colleague of yours invents a new projective test. 17 counselors rated the same client using the measure and produced nearly identical assessment. This would indicate, and the answer is letter B, high reliability. This is known as inter-rater reliability. Number 9, counselors often shy away from self-report since, and the answer is letter A, clients often give inaccurate answers. Say a client is monitoring her behavior and does not wish to disappoint her therapist. The report could be biased. This is a reactive effect of the self-monitoring. Number 10, in most instances, who would be the best qualified to give Rorschach ink blood test? And the answer is letter B, a licensed psychologist. Generally, clinical psychologists would have the most training in this area while psychometricians were not trained to administer projective tests. The social worker would have at the least education regarding test and measurement. 11. Your client who is an outpatient hospital program is keeping a journal of irrational thoughts. This would be, and the answer is letter C, an informal assessment technique. Self-report, case notes, checklists, sociogram of groups, interviews, and professional staffings would also fall into this category. Number 12, you are uncertain whether a test is intended for the population served by your not-profit organization. And the best method of researching this dilemma would be to, and the answer is letter C, read the test manual included with the test. The manual should specify target population for the test in question. Number 13, what client should know about assessment? And the answer is letter D. A test is merely a single source of data and not infallible. Although the first three choices are important to the counselor, the final statement should be explained to the client. An extremely high score, say, on a mechanical aptitude test does not automatically imply that the client will prosper in as a mechanic. Number 14, a major testing trend is, and the answer is letter A, computer-assisted testing and computer interpretation. Okay? So as we notice, lalo ngayon, online na ang maraming mga bagay. So modern testing catalog, you might think na ito yung mga lalabas ng mga software. Number 15, Mike takes a math achievement test. In order to predict his score, if he takes the test again, the counselor must know. And the answer is letter C, the standard error of measurement. The standard error is all you need to know. The SEM tells the counselor what would most likely occur if the same individual took the same test again. The question does not ask how well he did on the test, nor does it ask you to compare him to others. At natapos na naman ang drill natin ngayon. Ano kayang score mo? Paki-comment naman below. And I hope marami kang natutunan sa drill natin for today. Don't forget to click the subscribe button and hit the notification bell para ma-update ka lagi sa mga drills natin. Keep safe and have a nice day. Kamusta kayong lahat and welcome to another review for board exam, and we will have psychological assessment for today. Since ready ka na, simulan na natin. Psychological assessment review questions. Number 1. Most psychologists and counselors would agree that letter A, more preschool IQ testing is necessary. B, teachers need to give more personality tests. C, more public education is needed in the area of testing. And letter D, the testing mystique has been beneficial to the general public. Number 2, which of the following would be an informal method of appraisal? Is it A, IQ testing, B, standardized personality testing, C, GRE scores, or letter D, a checklist? Number 3, the WAIS 3 is given to 100,000 individuals in the United States who are picked at random. A psychometrician would expect that letter A, approximately 68% would score between 85 and 115. Letter B, approximately 68% would score between 70 and 130. Letter C, the mean IQ would be 112. And letter D, 50% of those tested would score 112 or above. Number 4, a word association test would be an example of A, a neuropsychological test, B, a motoric test, C, an achievement test, or letter D, a projective test. Number 5, an infant IQ test are A, more reliable than those given later in life, B, more unreliable than those given later in life, C, not related to learning experiences, and letter D, never used. Number 6, a good practice for psychometricians is A, to always test the client yourself rather than referring the client for testing. B, never generalize based on a single test scores. C, stay away from culture-free tests. Or letter D, stay away from scoring the test yourself. Number 7, you want to admit only 25% of all psychologists to an advanced training program in psychodynamic group therapy. The item difficulty of the entrance exam for applicants would be best set at A, 0.0, B, 0.5, C, 1.0, or letter D, 0.25. Number 8, a client goes to a string of 14 chemical dependency centers that operate on the 12-step model. When his current therapy suggests a new inpatient program, the client responds with What for? I already know the 12 steps. The client is using A. Deductive logic. B. Inductive logic. C. An emphatic assertion. Or D. An I statement. Number 9. Lewis Terman. A. Constructed the Wechsler's test. B. Constructed the initial Binet prior to 1910. C. Constructed the Rorschach. Or letter D. Americanized the Binet. Number 10. In constructing a test, you notice that all 75 people correctly answered item number 12. This gives you an item difficulty of A. 1.2, B. 0.75, C. 1.0, or letter D. 0.0. Number 11. The most valuable type of research is A. Always conducted using a factor analysis. B. Conducted using the chi-square. C. The experiment used to discover cause and effect relationship. Or D. The quasi-experiment. Number 12. Experiments emphasize parsimony, which means A. Interpreting the result in the simplest way. B. Interpreting the results in the most complex manner. C. Interpreting the result using a correlation coefficient. Or letter D. Interpreting the results using a clinical interview. Number 13. Occam-Razors suggests that experimenters A. Interpret the result in the simplest manner. B. Interpret the results in the most complex manner. C. Interpret the results using a correlation coefficient. Or letter D. Interpret the results using a clinical interview. Number 14. A counselor educator is running an experiment to test a new form of counseling. Unknown to the experimenter, one of the client is the study is secretly seeing a gestural therapist. This experiment, A, is parsimonious. B, an example of Occam-Razor. C, is confounded or flawed. Or D, is valid and will most likely help the field of counseling. And last, number 15, non-directive is to person-centered, as A. Psychological testing is to counseling. B. Confounding is to experimenting. C. Appraisal is to research. Or D. Parsimony is to Occam's razor. And let's now proceed to answers and explanations. Number 1. Most psychologists and counselors would agree that, and the answer is letter C. More public education is needed in the area of testing. Public need to know that there are limitations of testing or assessment. Many people are thinking that knowing your score represents who you are. Many people have been harmed by hearing their scores or their IQs because they don't know what it means. That is why it is very important and significant for us as counselors, psychometricians, and psychologists to explain the test results in the manner that they would understand it. Number 2, which of the following would be informal method of appraisal? And the answer is letter D, a checklist. Unlike A, B, and C, the informal method does not use standardized administration or scoring procedure, like doing a checklist or a diary, or there are so many ways that go about it that is totally in different manner. Unlike an informal testing, which is standardized in administration, scoring, and interpretation. Number 3, the WAIS 3 is given to 100,000 individuals in the US who are picked at random. A psychometrician would expect that. And the answer is letter A. Approximately 68% would score between 85 and 115. First, the Wechsler's IQ has been administered to a very large group of people, so chances are the distribution of score will be normal. This tells that the mean score will be 100, like an average IQ, and the standard deviation would be 15. So if the question were asked about Binet, you'd use 16 as a standard deviation. Number four, a word association test would be an example of, and the answer is letter D, a projective test. Although it is rare, some texts and exam take issues with the archaic word projective and refer to the test as self-expressive. Number five, infant tests are, and the answer is letter B, more unreliable than those given later in life. These toddler tests are sometimes capable of picking up gross abnormalities such as serious mental retardation. Number six, a good practice for psychometricians is, and the answer is letter B, never generalize based on a single test score. We usually give batteries of tests to provide relevant assessment. There's no single test that would explain a personality of an individual. Number seven, if you want to admit 25% of all psychologists to an advanced training program in psychodynamic group, and the answer would be letter D, 0.25. In most tests, the level is set at zero point 0.5, like 50% of the examinee would answer 50% correctly. However, in this case, since what you are looking for is 25%, 0.25 level would allow you to ferret out lower than 75%. You do not wish to admit item difficulty could range from 0 to 1.0. Number 8. A client goes to a string of 14 chemical dependency centers that operate on a 12-step model. When his current therapy suggests a new inpatient program, the client responded with, "What for? I already know the 12 steps the client is using." And the answer is letter A, deductive logic. Deductive, which sounds a bit like reductive, reduces the general to the specific. These questions would have been answered using deductive if the researcher observed many clients being cured. Number 9, Louis Thurman. And the answer is letter D, Americanized Binet. Since Thurman was associated with Stanford University, the test became the Stanford Binet. Number 10, in constructing a test, you notice that all 75 people correctly answered item number 12, description item difficulty of, and the answer is 1.0. Letter C. The item difficulty index is calculated by taking the number of persons tested who answered the item correctly over the total number of persons tested. Hence, in this case, 75 over 75 is equals to 1.0, which is the maximum score for an item. Number 11, the most valuable type of research is, and the answer is letter C, the experiment used to discover cause and effect relationship. Experimental research is the process of gathering data in order to make evaluative comparison regarding different situations. An experiment must have the condition of treatment controlled via the experimenter and random assignment, also known as randomization, that is used in groups. Number 12, experiments emphasize parsimony, which means, and the answer is letter A, interpreting the results in the simplest way. In research, we strive for parsimony in the sense that the easiest and less complex explanation is said to be the best. An economical description, if you will. Simply put, the simplest explanation of the findings is always preferred. Number 13, Occam's razor suggests that experimenters, and the answer is letter A, interpret the result in the simplest manner. Often, parsimony is also referred to Occam's razors, the principle of economy or Lloyd Morgan's 1894 canon or the law. Canon Lloyd Morgan was an English psychologist, physiologist, while Occam was the 14th century philosopher and theologian. Number 14. A counselor educator is running an experiment to test a new form of counseling. Unknown to the experiment, one of the clients in the study is secretly seeing a gestural therapist. This experiment, and the answer is letter C, confounded or flawed. The experiment is said to be invalid due to the extraneous independent variable, like attending the gestural therapy. Variables which are undesirable or compound or flaw the experiment. The only experimental variable should be the independent variable. In this case, the new form of counseling. The independent variable must have the effect on the dependent variable. And last, number 15, non-directive is to person-centered as, and the answer is letter D, parsimony is to Occam's razor. A simple analogy question, non-directive and person-centered therapy are synonymous. Both refer to the name given to Rogerian counseling. Parsimony is roughly synonymous with Occam's razor. And there goes the end of our drill for today. I hope you enjoyed learning and don't forget, pakitype nyo naman yung score ninyo. Don't forget to click subscribe and hit the notification bell para sa mga update ng drills natin. Keep safe and have a nice day. Kamusta na ang lahat? Panibagong 15 items na naman ang gagawin natin for psychological assessment para sa ating review for board exam. And since ready ka na, simulan na natin. Psychological assessment review question. Number 1. An experiment is said to be confounded when A. Undesirable variables are not kept out of the experiment. B. Undesirable variables are kept out of the experiment. C. Basic research is used in place of applied research. Or letter D. The sample is random. Number 2. In experimental terminology, IV stands for blank and DV stands for blank. A. Independent variable, dependent variable. B. Decent variable, indecent variable. C. Individual variable, dependent variable. D. Internal variable, designer variable. Number 3. A professor in psychology hypothesized that biofeedback training could reduce anxiety and improve the average score on written board exam. If the professor decides to conduct a formal experiment, the IV will be the blank and the DV will be the blank. A. Professor, anxiety level. B. Anxiety level, board exam score. C. Biofeedback, board exam score. D. Board exam score, biofeedback. Number 4, experimenters should always abide by a code of ethics. The variable you manipulate or control in an experiment is the A. DV. B. Dependent variable. C. The variable you will measure to determine the outcome. Or letter D. IV or independent variable. Number 5, in order for the professor in psychology to conduct an experiment regarding his hypothesis, he will need A or an A. Biofeedback groups systematic desensitization group. B. Control group, systematic desensitization group. C. Control group, experimental group. D. At least 60 subjects in the control group and at least 60 subjects in the experimental group. Number 6. In order for the psychology professor to conduct the experiment, the experimental group would need to receive A. The manipulated IV. B. The biofeedback training. C. A and B. Or D. The organismic independent variable. 7. Hypothesis testing is most closely related to the work of A. Happock, B. Freud, C. Lloyd Morgan, D. R. A. Fisher. Number 8. The null hypothesis suggests that there will be or there will not be a significant difference between the experimental group which received the IV and the control group which did not. Thus, if the experiment was conducted, the null hypothesis would suggest that A. All students receive biofeedback training would score equally well on the board exam. B. Systematic desensitization might work better than biofeedback. C. Biofeedback will not improve the board exam scores. Or D. Meta-analysis is required. Number 9. The hunch is known as the experimental or alternative hypothesis. The experimental hypothesis suggests that a difference will be evident between the control group and experimental group, like the group receiving the IV. Thus, if the experiment in question 3 were conducted, letter A, the biofeedback would raise the board scores. B, the control group would score better on the board exam. C, there will be no difference between the experimental and control groups. Or D, the experiment has been confounded. Number 10, from a purely statistical standpoint, in order to compare a control group which does not receive the IV or experimental manipulation to the experimental group, the researcher will need A. A correlation coefficient. B. Only descriptive statistics. C. Percentile rank. Or D. A test of significance. Number 11. When you see the letter P in relation to a test of significance, it means A. Portion. B. Population parameter. C. Probability. Or D. The researcher is using an ethnographic qualitative approach. Number 12. In the social sciences, the accepted probability level is usually A. 0.05 or less. B. 1.0 or higher. C. 0.001 or less. Or letter D. 5.0. Number 13. P equals 0.05 really means that A. 5 subjects were not included in the study. B. There's only a 5% chance that the difference between the control group and the experimental groups is due to the chance factor. C. The level of significance is 0.01. Or letter D. No level of significance has been set. Number 14. P is equals to 0.05 really means that A. Differences truly exist. The experimenter will obtain the same result 95% out of 100 times. B. Differences truly exist. The experimental will obtain the same results 99 out of 100 times. Or letter C. There is a 95% error factor. Or D. There is 10% error factor. And last, number 15, the study would be best rule out chance factors would have a significance level of P is equals to A. 0.05, B. 0.01, C. 0.001, or letter D. 0.08. And let's now proceed to answers and explanation. Number 1. An experiment is said to be confounded when, and the answer is letter A, Undesirable variables are not kept out of the experiment. Confounding is said to occur when an undesirable variable which is not controlled by the researcher is introduced in the experiment. Also, it also referred to as contaminating variable. Basic research is conducted to advance our understanding of theory, while applied research, also known as action research or experience near research, is conducted to advance our knowledge on how theories, skills, and techniques can be used in terms of practical application. Number two, in experimental terminology, IB stands for blank and DB stands for blank. And the answer is letter A. Variables in an experiment are categorized as independent variable or IV or dependent variable or DV. A variable is merely a behavior or circumstance that can exist on at least two levels or condition. In the experiment, the IV is the variable that the researcher manipulates, controls, alters, or wishes to experiment with. Number three, a professor in psychology hypothesized that biofeedback training could reduce anxiety and improve the average score on written board exam. If the professor decides to conduct a formal experiment, the IV will be the blank and the DB will be the blank. And the answer is letter C, biofeedback board exam score. The I statement here gives you the IV. For your DB, remember DV with letter D like data. Your data is provided by the board exam score. True, the researcher hypothesized that the training lowers anxiety, but you won't have any direct data regarding this trait. Hence, it will not be your DV in this experiment. Number four, experimenters should always abide by a code of ethics. The variable you manipulate or control in an experiment is the, and the answer is letter D, independent variable. In any experiment, the researcher is guided by ethics. This suggests first that subjects are informed of any risk. Second, the negative after effects are removed. Third, that you will allow subject to withdraw at any time. Fourth, that confidentiality of subjects will be protected. Fifth, that research reports will be presented in an accurate format that is not misleading. Six, that you will use only techniques that you are trained in. Research is considered a necessary factor in the profession. Number five, in order for professor in psychology to conduct an experiment regarding his hypothesis, he will need A or an, and the answer is letter C, control group, experimental group. The control group and the experimental group both have the same characteristic except that members of the control group will not have the experimental treatment applied to them. The control group does not receive the independent variable. The experimental group receives the IV or independent variable. The basic presupposition is that the average or means of the group do not differ significantly at the beginning of the experiment. Number six, in order for the psychology professor to conduct experiment, the experimental group would need to receive, and the answer is letter C, A and B. The experimental group receives the IV, which is in this case the biofeedback training. An organismic variable is one the researcher cannot control, yet it exists, such as height, weight, or gender. To determine whether an organismic independent variable exists, you simply ask yourself if there is an experimental variable being examined which you cannot manipulate. In most cases, when you are confronted with IVDB identification questions, the IB will be of the manipulated variety. Number seven, hypothesis testing is mostly closely related to the work of, and the answer is letter D, Fisher. Hypothesis testing was pioneered by R.A. Fisher. A hypothesis is a hunch or an educated guess which can be tested utilizing the experimental model. A hypothesis might be that biofeedback raises board exam scores or that reality therapy reduces dysfunctional classroom behavior in high school, or perhaps that cognitive therapy relieves depression in males in the midst of pandemic. A hypothesis is a statement which can be tested regarding the relationship of the IV and the DV. 8. The null hypothesis suggests that there will be no significant difference between experimental group. And the answer is letter C. Biofeedback will not improve the board exam scores. The null hypothesis asserts that the sample will not change even after the experimental variable is applied. The null hypothesis states that the control group and the experimental is will not differ at the end of the experiment. The null hypothesis is simply that the IV does not affect the DB. Null means nil or nothing. Null is a statement of no difference. Number 9, a hunch is known as the experimental or alternative hypothesis. And the answer is letter A. The biofeedback would raise the board scores. An alternative hypothesis, which may be called the affirmative hypothesis on your exam, asserts that the IV has indeed caused a change. Number 10, from a purely statistical standpoint, in order to compare control group to the experimental group, the researcher will need, and the answer is letter D, a test of significance. Choice A, or correlation research, does not make use of the paradigm in which an IV is experimentally introduced. Descriptive statistics, or choice B, as the name implies, merely describes the data. In order to compare two groups, inferential statistics, which infers something about the population, are necessary. Number 11, when you see the letter P in relation to a test of significance, it means, and the answer is letter C, probability. A parameter is technically a value obtained from a population, while statistics is a value drawn from a sample. A parameter summarizes a characteristic of population. The correct answer is choice C, which refers to the probability or the level of significance. Traditionally, the probability in social science research, often indicated by P, has been set at 0.05. The 0.05 level indicates that differences would occur by a chance only 5 times in 100. Number 12, in the social science, the accepted probability level is usually, and the answer is letter A. 0.05 and 0.01 are the two most popular level of significance in social science research. Number 13, P is equals to zero point 0.5 really means that, and the answer is letter B. Many experts in the field feels that it is misleading when many exams still refer to this as the 95% confidence interval, meaning that the result would be due to chance only 5 times out of 100. When P is equals to 0.05, differences in the experimental group and control group are evident at the end of the experiment, and the odds are only 1 in 20. That is, can be explained by chance. So, once more, for good measure, your exam could refer to the level of significance as the level of confidence, or simply the confidence level. The meaning is intended to be the same. Number 14. P is equals to 0.05 really means that? And the answer is letter A. Number 15. The study that would best rule out chance factors would have a significant level of P. And the answer is letter C. The smaller the value for the P, the more stringent the level of significance. Here, the 0.001 level is the most stringent level listed, indicating that there is only one chance in 1,000 that the results are due to chance versus 20 for 0.05 and the 1 in 100 for 0.01. In plain English, it is easier to get significant result using 0.08, 0.05, 0.01 than it is using 0.001. At natapos muli tayo sa ating drill. I hope nag-enjoy ka sa ginawa nating exercise. Anong score mo? Paki-type in mo naman. And don't forget to click subscribe and hit the notification bell para lagi kang nare-remind na meron pa tayong review. Don't forget to keep safe and have a nice day.